This video is to help you develop strategies for rewriting, terminating, and repeating decimals as fractions, and it's section 2.1.2. So it reminds us that in the lesson from 2.1.1, we worked with different fractions and found ways to write those fractions as either repeating or terminating decimals. In this lesson, we're going to reverse our thinking and go the other direction. So remember that we have worked before with the portions web, knowing that we can make connections and make transitions from fractions to decimals to percents to words or picture. So for 218, they want us to complete a percentage or complete a representation, of a portions web for each number. So they did the example of 2/3. Now, 2/3, of course, in words can be written as 2/3 in that way. If you divide 2/3, what you get is 0.6 repeating. So if you take 2 and divide it by 3, what you're going to end up getting is going to be 0.6, and then those 6s are going to repeat. Okay. And we talked about that a bit yesterday. So what's happening then is when you write it as a decimal, we'll write it as 0.6 repeating in that format. When you write it as a percentage, though, that can be a little confusing. So what you want to do is think about that again. 0.6 repeating means, 0.6 with all these 6s continuing to repeat. And when you then want to change it to a percent, you just move the decimal point 2 places to the right, and you get 66 point, and then those 6s continue to repeat. So 66.6 repeating percent would be fine. They went 66 2/3%, which is the same. 0.6 repeating again is 2/3. But either of these formats would be fine, in my opinion, for the representation of the percent. So if we were trying to change 7/10 to a decimal, we would get 7/10 written in that way. The words for 7/10 would be like this, 7/10. All right. And when you want to go from that decimal to percent, remember again, you're going to move that decimal point 2 places to the right. And when you move it 2 places to the right and add the percent sign, you get 70%. Okay. Then 75/100ths, as a decimal, is 75%, moving that decimal 2 places to the right, adding a percent sign. 75% or 75/100ths is 3/4 when you simplify the fraction. And for words, you can write it as 3/4. Now you can also write it in words as 75/100ths. Okay. So keep that in mind as you do that. So I won't go through the additional ones there, but again, that is the idea of the connection. Now, they want to remind you in 219 that when we describe a decimal in words, we write it with the correct denominator as well. So for example, 7/10 is described in words as 7/10, so it makes sense that the equivalent fraction is also 7/10. So again, that's one of those logical connections that math has. We use the same vocabulary, we call it 7/10 because the equivalent fraction is 7/10. And the place right behind the decimal point is the tenths place. So if we were trying to think about how we would name this decimal, we would say 1900ths. This one would be 391 thousandths. Remember, we read it as though it's an entire number, and then we look at the last digit, what place value that's in is the correct place value. So 391 thousandths. This would be 1 thousandths. This would be 19 thousandths. All right. This would be 3/10. And this would be 524 thousandths. So based on the way that we read those, that's also how we write the fraction. We said this would be 1900ths, so we'd write the fraction 1900ths. 391 thousandths, 391 thousandths. 1 thousandths, 19 thousandths, 3/10, and 524 thousandths. Now this one can be simplified, as you can see I did. I first divided both these by 2 and then by 2 again to get a final fraction that's simplified. But the key is you can, if you're reading the decimals correctly using your correct place value vocabulary, you have the fractions from that. Okay. Then they talk about in 221, how can you convert from a fraction to a decimal if you get a repeating decimal? Well, if you take 19 divided by 99, 391 divided by 999, and so forth, what you end up finding is there is a repeating pattern to them. All right. So 1999ths is 0.19 repeating. 391 999ths is 0.391 repeating. 3/9 is 0.3 repeating. 1 999th is 0.001 repeating. All right. So if you look at these, which again, you could find these from put them in your calculator, numerator divided by denominator, you see that there is a pattern here. Again, mathematics has an inherent pattern. So then based on that pattern, they want to see if you can figure out what would be the fraction equivalency for this. All right. And then what would be the decimal equivalency for this? So that's what they're looking for to understand there. So again, look these over, pause the video if you need to, and see if you can find the connections there. All right. The next video we'll do with the homework for that section.